Welcome to the debate. Today we're analyzing a really fascinating intersection in 19th century literature, looking at two giants, Robert Browning, the master of the dramatic monologue, and Edgar Allan Poe, the architect of the modern short story. Both were innovators, and both were deeply struggling for critical and financial recognition in the fiercely competitive transatlantic literary market of the 1830s and 1840s.
Absolutely. In that period, right, when publishing was shifting so dramatically away from, small party presses toward these large, sensational penny newspapers, it put immense pressure on authors to create something short, punchy, and utterly compelling. It was a crisis moment that demanded new forms.
And that demand led to some striking artistic overlap. We're focusing on material written and published roughly between 1834 and 1843. The question is whether the similarities we find in their specific themes, their tone, and, I think most importantly, their unique technical strategies are the result of direct mutual influence, meaning one was reading and learning from the other, or if they represent independent parallel experimentation driven by those exact economic and critical pressures you just described. My position is that the highly specific technical and thematic echoes make a very strong case for influence.
And I'm going to maintain that the overarching power of the shared historical moment, the sheer necessity of artistic and financial survival, is the sufficient, non-influential explanation. They were simply two highly intelligent authors, independently arriving at the same stylistic recipe, if you will, that was required to thrive in a chaotic new publishing landscape.
Okay, so let's start with the thematic correspondences, because they are almost shocking in their proximity. If we look at works published almost back-to-back in 1835 and 1836, the similarity is, well, it's difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. In 1835, Poe publishes Berenice, which features a mentally unstable narrator, Aegeus, who is driven to horrific lengths against his female partner, obsessively fixated on her teeth.
A truly gruesome tale, even for Poe.
Then, the very next year, Browning publishes Porphyria's Lover. And here we have another mentally unstable male narrator who murders his female partner. But instead of teeth, his fetishistic focus is on her hair, which he then uses to strangle her. I mean, the core shared structure is it's undeniable. The murder of a female partner by a psychologically deranged male narrator, often focusing on a specific fetishistic physical detail.
That thematic pattern is certainly arresting.
And it doesn't stop there. Look at 1842. Poe publishes The Oval Portrait, a brief Gothic tale centered on the image of a deceased wife whose painted portrait serves as a kind of spectral evidence of her death. That same year, Browning publishes My Last Duchess, which revolves entirely around the portrait of a deceased wife, where the Duke's monologue strongly implies his role in her suggested murder. Both use the painted image of a wife, who is now dead or presumed killed, as the central motif for a very confined psychological exploration.
Right. Those pairings are compelling. But while we agree that documented proof of direct reading is thin before 1845, when Poe sent his major works across the Atlantic, we do know they were aware of each other. So the core of your argument, then, is that the specificity of these coincidences implies a kind of secret, deliberate borrowing, perhaps suppressed because of professional pride?
Exactly. At that stage in their careers, both authors were fighting for relevance. Neither wanted to admit they were influenced by a contemporary who was also struggling and, frankly, often despised by highbrow critics. The lack of documentation might itself be strategic, but the structural and thematic parallels are just too precise, too timely, to be an accident of the calendar.
I come at it from a completely different angle, though. The similarities aren't some secret handshake between writers. They are the result of independently developing the same necessary toolkit to survive the market. The rise of the penny press meant authors had to grab the reader immediately and keep them captivated, often by blending highbrow literary demands with sensational, melodramatic content, a stylistic recipe I would call an early Victorian tendency in stylistic innovation.
I see why you think that, but let's challenge that market argument right at the specific content level.
Please do.
While market demand for sensationalism was high across the board, why did they converge on such specific forms of moral and intellectual deviation? It's not just general crime stories, Both writers repeatedly used shared elements like suggested adultery, which is hinted at strongly in the Duchess's taming and Aegeus's wife's interactions, and, most importantly, the explicit linking of crime and murder with a specific, contained psychological madness. This specific madness, known at the time as monomania.
Ah, that concept of monomania is crucial here. In the 1830s and 40s, monomania was a widely discussed theory, suggesting a person could be perfectly rational in all aspects of life except for one obsessive fixation, be it teeth, hair, or perhaps the control of a wife.
Precisely. And this goes beyond general sensationalism. They seem to be deploying a shared strategy for making sensational content palatable to the critical elite. They could take a gruesome murder which would otherwise be dismissed as cheap penny-press pulp and elevate it by framing the central character as a fascinating psychological study, a case for scientific or pseudoscientific interest.
So you're suggesting they used monomania as a justification device to gain critical respectability while still appealing to the public's morbidity?
Absolutely. They elevated mass morbidity into high art under the guise of psychological exploration. That level of sophisticated, shared justification for controversial subject matter points toward a shared learning curve, where one author saw the effectiveness of the strategy and adapted it.
That's a compelling reading of their strategic motives, but I would argue that this strategic convergence actually proves the strength of the shared environment, not influence. Have you considered the evidence regarding their common sources? I mean, the historical material points out that the inspiration behind many of these sensational tales came from documented, widely circulating events, reports, and periodical publications of the time.
Like what, specifically?
Well, the notorious Kentucky tragedy, a sensational murder case from the 1820s, served as documented inspiration for Poe's early drama, Polition, which shares thematic DNA with his later tales. The point is that the raw material for sensational themes, crime, mental imbalance, sexual deviation, was a universal circulating resource in the transatlantic press. Both authors, desperate for material that would sell and yet elevate, simply drew from the same global pool of journalistic reports and cultural events. The convergence is thematic because the cultural fodder was shared globally, making influence unnecessary to explain the overlaps.
That's a fair point. But let's move past the thematic content, which I agree can be sourced globally, and focus on the technical execution. That is far harder to explain away as mere coincidence.
I agree that the technique is the most illuminating area for debate. For me, the strongest argument for independent convergence lies in their shared rhetorical strategy, the use of the subjective, unreliable voice and the shared technique of deferring closure.
Okay, walk me through that, especially for a listener who might not be steeped in literary theory.
Certainly. Both the dramatic monologue and Poe's short story structure use a very specific kind of narrator, one who is telling the story from their own limited, often deranged perspective. They're what we'd call homodiegetic in Poe, or dramato-lyrical in Browning, meaning they are the central voice, but their version of events cannot be trusted. Think of the Duke in My Last Duchess. He tries to paint himself as the injured party, the noble figure, but every line he speaks reveals him to be obsessive, controlling, and potentially a murderer. He is unreliable.
Right. And how does that relate to deferring closure?
Because the narrator is unreliable, the author leaves deliberate gaps, what we might call a communicative void, that the reader is forced to fill. The murder in Porphyria's lover happens mid-monologue, and we never get any external judgment or punishment. In The Duchess, we never hear the Duke confess. We only get that subtle, terrifying hint. I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. The author deliberately refuses to provide a neat, traditional ending. This forces the reader to engage dialogically, to become the detective, the moral judge, and to complete the text themselves.
I think that's an exceptionally detailed observation about their shared rhetorical effect. But why do you see that sophisticated technique as evidence of convergence rather than borrowing?
Because the necessity of brevity dictated this style. If you only have a short space, a short story, or a short monologue, you can't rely on developing a complex plot over 100 pages. You have to subordinate the plot entirely to the character's psychology, focusing vertically to achieve maximum intensity. This technique, the psychological exposure achieved through the unreliable voice, was the most efficient artistic response to the brevity demanded by publication constraints. It allowed them to elevate content that might otherwise be seen as just sensational.
I see why you think that, but I would frame it differently. This is such an extremely specific, high-risk artistic maneuver. Browning, after his early failures in full drama, was clearly searching for a successful short form. It seems highly plausible that upon encountering the intense effect Poe achieved with this unreliable subjective focus in his early tales, Browning adapted that precise psychological intensity and focus into his dramatic monologue format.
So you're arguing he borrowed the structure of the effect itself rather than just the idea of being sensational?
Exactly. It's the architecture of terror they share. And furthermore, they share a very specific structural choice to achieve a quality I'd call lyrical universality. Both often use vague characterization, nameless, genderless figures, loosely located settings like Ferrara or a Spanish cloister, to keep the subject generalized enough for critical admiration, while the internal psychology remains terrifyingly intense. This shared use of vagueness is too specific a structural choice to be accidental. It speaks to a shared understanding of how to maximize psychological terror while maintaining critical distance.
But this shared technical decision, the use of vagueness, again, it points right back to the market. In a period of high competition, achieving lyrical universality means you're maximizing your potential audience and ensuring the theme feels relevant to more than just a single local crime report. That's a strategic calculation any sophisticated author trying to make a living would arrive at independently.
I'm still not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the final crucial point is the remarkable similarity in tone and degree. This points to a direct, shared awareness of how to achieve maximal emotional effect through language.
Well, we both agree they aimed for maximal effect. Poe himself wrote extensively about the unity of effect that a short composition must achieve.
Right, but look at how they achieve it. Both authors rely on intensified, sensational detail, using extreme rhetoric like hyperbole and intense modifiers. Poe speaks of delirious horror, and his characters look pale as the tenant of a tomb. The language is saturated. But what makes this so specific is that the material notes these compositions also share certain repetitions and rhythmic structures that create a poetic rhythm, even in Poe's prose narrative.
That is fascinating, that rhythmic quality in Poe's prose.
And it suggests a specific, shared awareness of how to blend lyrical, highbrow aesthetics, which was Browning's background in poetry, with sensational, penny-press narrative conventions. They weren't just sensational, they were sensational poetically. They deliberately elevated the degree of emotion through this linguistic fusion. That blend is their signature.
I think the heightened tone sends me the universal survival mechanism in that market. The rhetorical devices, the exclamations, the high drama, the hyperbole, were standard tools for sensationalized content in periodicals generally. They were just required to capture attention. If Browning, a lyrical poet, needed to write something sensational, he would naturally deploy the language and intensity he was most familiar with, that of high emotion.
But that's precisely where the influence is most likely to have occurred. They were both attempting to maximize the effect of their compositions, but the specific path they took to blend poetic rhythm with journalistic sensation is identical. It's evidence of a shared learning curve regarding how to execute this high-impact, short composition following the same dictates of attention that saturated the industry. It's not just that they aimed for intensity, it's that they used the same specific linguistic architecture to achieve it.
I still see the shared tone as an inevitable response to identical external pressure. They both needed to stand out in a deafeningly noisy marketplace. An intense, rhythmically saturated language was the most effective, universal tool for achieving that attention in short forms. I find it more compelling to trust the documented external pressures than to assume undocumented intellectual borrowing.
So to summarize my position, the claim for mutual influence rests on the overwhelming volume of coincidence, the numerous, detailed, technical, structural, and thematic overlaps between works composed and published
almost simultaneously between 1834 and 1843. Given their mutual awareness of each other's presence in the transatlantic literary circles, the most logical explanation for such deep similarities in highly innovative, specialized forms, especially the technique of the unreliable narrator and fetishistic monomania, is that they were indeed reading each other's successful experimental strategies, even if professional pride demanded they maintain silence about their contemporary influences.
And my summary is that the evidence for parallel experimentation remains stronger because it relies on documented external economic and critical pressures. Both Poe and Browning were facing the same existential crisis in their careers, forcing them to appeal to the same fluctuating market tastes, a paradoxical blend of populist sensationalism and critical sophistication. This shared crisis led them independently to develop identical stylistic innovations, reducing length, maximizing sensational themes, and perfecting that technique of the unreliable subjective voice and the deferral of closure. The similarities are not the product of influence, but the necessary condition for survival in the cutthroat early Victorian market.
Well, regardless of whether they were reading over each other's shoulders or merely reacting to the same seismic shifts in publishing, the sheer depth of their similarities, especially in their shared architectural choices for terror, serves powerfully to illuminate the intensity of the early Victorian literary struggle.
Indeed, and it underscores the remarkable fact that such profound artistic innovation, which helped define modern literary structure, emerged directly out of such fierce economic and critical pressure. We still have much to explore regarding the precise mechanisms of how these short forms captured, and still capture, the reader's attention.